This podcast is brought to you by Always Possible.
alwayspossible.co.uk.
Well, hello and welcome to The Possibility Club, a crucible of ideas where we ignite conversations that matter. I'm Richard Freeman, your navigator in this exploration of thought and action. Today we delve into a realm where education intersects with global citizenship, technological innovation, and the art of building interconnected communities. In this episode, we're going to unravel some of the threads of culture, technology, and human experience through exploring how education shapes our understanding of ourselves and our place in a rapidly evolving global society. We're going to ponder questions central to our time, like how does the digital age redefine our learning? What roles do empathy, creativity, and connection play in a crafting of a more inclusive and compassionate world? Stepping into this conversation is a visionary who embodies these queries, and my special guest this week is an educator, thinker, and storyteller, has journeyed through cultures and continents gathering insights like pearls from the ocean of global experience, and his approach to learning and living challenges us to rethink our roles as individuals and as part of a larger, interconnected community. From the classrooms of prestigious international schools to the boardrooms of Silicon Valley, my guest's diverse experiences have shaped his understanding of education as a dynamic, living ecosystem. His philosophy champions a holistic approach to learning, one that nurtures not just academic prowess, but also the emotional and social well-being of individuals. So let's unravel how his journey and ideologies resonate with broader themes of our interconnected world. Decentralizing human narratives, embracing technology as a bridge rather than a barrier, and fostering environments where empathy and innovation are not just encouraged or talked about as character and something on the side, soft skills, all that nonsense, but as essential to who we are. So a very warm welcome to you and to my guest as we explore practical bravery in coconut thinking. Meet Dr Benjamin Freud. Well, hello. Welcome to the Possibility Club. I'm Richard Freeman, your irascible host, and that's the wrong word, completely wrong word, but it's the word I'm going to use because it's the word that's tripped off my tongue. As usual, I am talking to an extraordinary guest who is doing bold and brave and impactful things to just try and unpick a little bit of that and try and find out where that's coming from and what their sort of mission is for the world. And I am absolutely delighted to be joined today by Dr. Benjamin Freud, who is a man of the world. Looking through his biography, there's very few countries he doesn't seem to have worked in, lived in, or had some kind of footprint in. A real pioneer in sort of education and emergent thinking, which is something I really want to delve into. Perhaps before we do that, firstly, how are you?
Great, Richard. Thanks so much for having me and saying such kind words. And I'm calling you from Chiang Mai, Thailand, where I'll be here for the next 2 or 3 weeks and then off to Bali to resettle in Bali.
So is Bali sort of more home these days? Where is home for you?
That's a good question. No, Bali will be home. I will be transitioning to be the head of upper school at the Green School Bali. Mm-hmm. And that will be our next move. Home generally is going to be Paris, France. Mm-hmm. Or the UK, simply because my wife is from the UK and I tend to end up there probably a little bit more than anywhere else in the world.
You know, if you could sum up your kind of overall journey into kind of rethinking education, you know, where did that start from? What was the impetus? Tell me a little bit about your own sort of background and experience. I mean, when I look through your education sort of career, you've studied lots and in lots of places. So I imagine that's led you to kind of putting pieces of the jigsaw together. And also the more cheeky question, you know, does being a Dr. Freud have its, is it a good or a bad thing in terms of the weight of history and the other many Dr. Freuds that have come before you?
Very, very good questions. I love the cheeky questions. And I love school. I absolutely love school. And I love it not for the doctor, not for the pieces of paper that they end up giving you at the end, but rather just because I just really enjoy being around people who like to talk and do and think about stuff that I'm interested in. It's actually quite indulgent, if anything. And much of, the idea of being Dr. Freud, it's a weird thing in our society where letters behind your name, you have to play this game because it gives you, for some reason, credibility. And that's something that, frankly, I struggle with because I kind of use it when I feel like it, but I always feel a little bit dirty doing so. So it's a tension within myself because I'm someone who's extremely academic, but I give absolutely no weight to the elitism that often comes with academia, with having these degrees, these certificates. I just really like school and writing, and that's just my passion. Just end up getting pieces of paper at the end for it.
So, coconut thinking. Talk me through it. What is coconut thinking to you?
Well, I think it always is going to be years and years and years of everything, since nothing starts at the beginning, because there probably is no beginning. And to continue on the question that you posed earlier, I mean, I love school and I've always studied things like revolution, and I've always studied things like nationalist movements and social justice, economic justice, and so forth. And then I started my career in Silicon Valley in the late 90s. And I was probably about 23, 24. And I was working with people who were, 27, 28, 29. So just a little bit older. And back then, the difference between 23 and 28 is going to be a big difference. And these guys were changing the world. And they said there's no rules. And that really influenced me. And so education is my second career, but I brought so many lessons from that. And I brought so many lessons about the way things could be and the fact that rules are just rules because somebody wrote them, but they don't necessarily have any anchor in what's good for the world. And so the word coconut is a little bit cheeky, and frankly, it just came off the tip of my tongue because I love coconuts. But the real justification is simple, is the fact that a coconut is both a fruit and a seed, and it's also a nut. And I just like this idea of being able to be multiple things at the same time. I would probably not use the word thinking if I were to do it again, simply because I associate thinking with so much of what's in our head. And I'm so much more interested in the way we relate thinking and sensing and intuition and feeling, and how those things can't be dissociated. But unfortunately, in our society, we have thinking. So I'd probably rename it, but for now, we'll stick with coconut thinking.
The coconut is what breaks all the rules. It doesn't put itself in a box. And why should we? I like that a lot. So let's go back to your Silicon Valley career then first, before we come on to the work you've been doing in education. What were you doing there? Who were these 29-year-olds changing the world? What was the sort of technology at the time that felt, brilliantly, dangerously revolutionary?
So I moved to San Francisco wanting to go into the nonprofit world to work in economic development, which has nothing to do with technology. And then I figured out that you actually needed to get paid properly to live in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, and that working in the nonprofit world wasn't going to, I just wasn't going to be able to survive on what was there and how difficult it was. So I ended up doing technology consulting because, I like computers. I had a tech support job in grad school, and it just ended up falling like that. And this was a time in the late 97, 98, the late 90s, where people were setting up things like B2C sites. And maybe we can set up a free website for businesses to sell their wares online. Yahoo had just gone public. We were looking at things like, how are we going to be able to speak to each other over the internet? And so, some of the people who were working, they left their big companies like Oracle, and they left their big companies like, whatever software there was, be it Intuit or whatever. And they were setting up their own shop, and they were in little rooms inside bigger rooms and working. I remember once they were working on refurbished doors because they couldn't afford tables. And they just said, we're just going to do it. We're going to work hard and change the way business is done and people communicate with one another. And that's a spirit that I just absolutely loved. They didn't think that they could fail. And I loved it. It's so inspiring.
Is it now what we hear a bit more within the kind of dogma that the failure is part of the process, and actually it's fail quick, fail cheap, keep going?
Yeah, it's probably a lot of that. And maybe not thinking you could fail means that when you fail, you're not failing. And let's remember, it's also a time when nobody was making any money, but the valuations and people were being bought out for billions and hundreds of millions of dollars. So even if they didn't make a single dollar, they were still getting bought out. It's a completely different time. And after the crash in 2000, we kind of rethink this, but we have to take ourselves back to that time when there was more money than sense, and anybody could get funding to do just about anything. And while that's kind of foolish in hindsight, the energy that was there was amazing. The ideas that were there, the creation that were done. It was truly inspiring. And people said, we're not going to do it the old way. We're going to do this brand new way. It was indulgent. It was hedonistic. There were so many dark sides to it. But I'll take back this rule breaking. I'll take back these long-haired kids who just didn't care. And we're going to say, I quit my job so I can make something on myself. And I don't think that it was always for the money. I think a lot of it was for the creativity and wanting to change things. Oftentimes it was the money. I'm not naive, but often it was just, let's just change the world.
Where did you go next? If that energy was so intoxicating and there was all that opportunity, you talked about the kind of crash in 2000. Was that a marker in the sand for you, or had you already left, or did you continue after that?
I went to business school in 2000. Thinking that if I went to business school, then maybe I might be able to transition because there were all these great jobs in Silicon Valley and it's going to be wonderful. I'm going to know a little bit more about what it means to look at business plans and to be able to do all this great stuff. And I'm just going to walk into any job, and then the market crashed and I didn't have that opportunity. Terrible timing. Never follow my advice financially, that's for sure, or just do the opposite. And so then I moved to London, where I lived for 4 years and went also into consulting during some pretty difficult times and worked consulting for larger technology companies and FMCGs. Worked through that before moving to Japan. My previous wife moved to Japan, so I followed her for her job and was introduced to Asia. I'd never been to Asia, and she called me up and said, "You want to move to Asia?" And I said, "Sure, let's just go." So we picked up sticks and just went. I thought it was going to be Singapore, and ended up being Tokyo, and it was amazing. Ended up, being exposed to so many different people and ideas, and that was wonderful. Also had a big dark side. And then eventually moved to Singapore, and I said, this is the only opportunity I'll have in my entire life to be able to do a PhD. Again, self-indulgence, absolutely. And that made me investigate different worlds. And then I had a child, and it was really when I had a child that I realized I get a lot of energy from kids. Simple as that. I find them hilarious. I find them more interesting than many adults that I meet. And I just really enjoy this world of learning, teaching, being with kids, having a good time with them, making sure that their experiences are fun. And that's how I got into education. And so taking what I learned from the consulting world of kind of being able to be nimble in the mind, adaptable, looking at different things. Yeah, it brought me something different that I hope adds to what I do now in schools.
Which education system, and I use that word advisedly, did you find yourself in first? Because I think so much of what you're saying you feel is important, that nimbleness, that creativity, that curiosity, that rule breaking, feels so wildly incompatible with some of the systems that have been developed since the sort of 1800s in much of the Western world. I can see many systems I'm familiar with where you would be an absolute renegade and either brilliantly succeed by finding the right allies or fall at the first hurdle because no one would allow space for it. So tell me a little about the systems you worked in or became to understand as a sort of practitioner and an academic.
This is an excellent question, I think, because it really gives insight into people's experiences, and our experiences shape who we are, certainly help us shape that, which kind of goes into this idea of emergent learning that we might touch on later. But my first stable job in education was at a school that was actually 3 different schools. One for highly abled, I won't use the word gifted, but that's the word that they used, but highly abled kids. The second was for kids with social depression, anxiety, people who couldn't make it in the state system because of emotional issues. And the third was kids with autism, enough that they couldn't make it again in the state system. So I was teaching classes with all 3 kinds of students, all 3 demographics. So that means that you have to adapt and think and see what happens because anything might happen. Teaching kids who come to school, there's so many educators who go through this. So I'm not saying it's a special experience, but I was lucky enough to be in a school that allowed you to be adaptable and allowed you to respond to the needs of the students right there and then. Sometimes it just wasn't a good day to be learning about World War II. I don't know. I'm just making it up, but it just wasn't. The kids weren't emotionally ready. Kids that came in bandaged because they were breaking bottles with their fists probably aren't going to be open to learning. So let's talk about different things. Let's talk about how we can get through this together and the relationships that we have. Sometimes you have kids who are so beyond in terms of their abilities that whatever you plan or decide, they're already 15 steps ahead of you. other times you have kids with autism who really act in ways that aren't necessarily as predictable as kids who are neurotypical. So I was very lucky to be able to be in a school that allowed me to be adaptable and flexible. And that doesn't always happen. So I'm not saying that the experience in itself is particularly extraordinary from the demographic point of view, but it was because I was able to do what I needed to do to put the kids first. And that's really what interests me. And what I felt meaningful and for them, the relationship that was there. And then I moved to Hong Kong before my ex-wife back then as well. And I worked at a school that was trying to break the rules. They were just building up their high school. They were a 21st century world school finalist. And all they wanted to do was create an inclusive environment where children were able to exist on an equal level with the teachers. So they weren't even the idea of teacher and student. It was all learners and everybody followed the same rules. And the kids could decide what classes that they wanted to study. And then the teachers, and I'm going to use these words to expedite, were there to kind of design these classes around the students. And there was flexibility and it was mixed age. And, there was, again, being able to pivot. So this is, again, so lucky to be in these environments. And those were the years that shaped me. And since I've been in more traditional environments, but I was, again, lucky to be in these places where there was fluidity, adaptability, and just a different narrative that was told.
This podcast is brought to you by Always Possible. But who are we?
Always Possible works with ambitious businesses, charities, and public services that are thinking about what's next.
From architects to aerospace companies, puppet theatres to primary schools, business networks to big data analysts.
If you're wanting to be brave with some big decisions or to be clearer about what to prioritise, then an award-winning workshop from the Always Possible team is a brilliant starting point.
We care about just one thing: building ideas that work.
For creative, intuitive, and practical expertise, consider Always Possible as your strategic partner. Find out more about how we could power up your mission. Visit alwayspossible.co.uk.
alwayspossible.co.uk.
And it sometimes feels, that flexibility, that creativity, thrives at the edges rather than sort of in the middle, in the mainstream. And it's almost like critical mass or conformity is the enemy of exciting education that really has the learners at the heart of it. And I can understand many reasons for that. Lots of them are financial and lots of them are regulatory and so on. But those examples you've given, were they normal were they mainstream in the countries within which you were working, or were they seen as sort of slightly outliers there as well?
Well, certainly in Hong Kong, it was an outlier. And I guess this opens the door for the question, why was it an outlier? Why is it that you are an outlier schools when you put the needs of the students first and the relationships with the students first? Why is that seen as something that's weird? Why is it that we can say, well, that wouldn't happen at my school? Why is it that we find that acceptable? What is more important than our relationships with one another? And the way I see it, this idea that if we cultivate and nurture the relationships between each other, we might cultivate and nurture the relationships with other living things, trees, birds, animals, other humans out there. Why is it acceptable that the fringe is where you're able to be flexible and adaptable for learning and not in the center? So yeah, it was different. And part of me thinks, well, that's not the case of most educators out there, but it's unacceptable that it's not. Simply unacceptable.
When it comes to the process or the model of convergent, emergent, and divergent thinking, I'm going to run through what my basic understanding is. So in my mind, convergent thinking is that mainstream, that hegemony, the consensus that may be easy, but is often very narrow and linear. And then the goal is divergent thinking, which is then accepting that there are multiple potential ways to do things, that there is a pluralism in a thriving society, which allows for where the individual meets the collective, etc. And so then the emergent thinking is the kind of messy space in the middle, when you move from that blob that moves as one into that more creative, nimble, open, and ultimately sort of more enlightened space. That's how I've sort of always thought about it when I've sort of tried to bottle it up in my head. Now, tell me I'm wrong or tell me I'm right, and tell me what your work around emergent thinking is and how that translates into education.
I'm going to probably reframe it just a little bit from design thinking and these words of divergent and convergent thinking in that sense. Just kind of step back a little bit and present it more in terms of living systems. A living system is something that doesn't exist on its own. We as humans, as part of the world, animals, anything that's a living system, this could be organizations as well, of course, exist because of the networks in which they are. And there is a certain kind of weird boundary between it and the other world. So it's a permeable boundary. So you, for instance, are who you are, but the boundary around you is kind of, it's kind of weird where it is, right? We kind of think that it's at the end of our skin, but when you think about all the little critters that live on your skin, maybe it goes a little bit further. And the fact that you need food and to take food in means that you're also kind of extending towards other living systems that are out there. And of course, you're part of a family and you're part of, colleagues and so forth. So these are things that then move around. But the living system also isn't something that you can control. You can't control another living system. You can stimulate it and disturb it. You can exercise something or try to touch it or influence it in a way, and it disturbs it. A machine is different because a machine, you could turn your car on and off and it responds to you can't control it. In schools, we talk about the industrial age of schools, this industrial model of education, but one of the things that we don't always think about is the fact that schools, you think of learning like a machine, an algorithm in many ways. If I present this curriculum that I've been teaching for the last 5 years and have these learning objectives, we're going to take these kids through this linear path and reach this outcome where they will have a standardized test, and I will assess them along the way to make sure that there's a certain level of quality. And if the quality is not met, we will have an intervention to make sure that the quality is raised, which is what you do when you make, an automobile at the factory. So you are trying to control this narrative of learning, of the fact that we are going to go through this, if this, then that situation. And really look at it, again, in this linear way of trying to get everything the same way with these learning objectives. We want to go here in this linear path. This idea of emergent learning is actually much more like a living system, that you can only create the conditions and the context for something to happen, but you cannot control what happens. I cannot control if I go through if I tell you something, I can't control what you're learning from it. I can't control how you're going to respond to it. I can only disturb you. And by that, I mean have some kind of change in your affect, in the way you are structured, respond, something that you learn, but I can't control that. I can only create the conditions with intention to get us somewhere. So if we think about it this way, if we think about anything else in the world outside of school, it's actually generally what happens. We want to build a bicycle that is going to be, super fast and efficient and so forth. We're going to say, okay, we're going to build this bicycle that's going to sell lots of units, and it's going to be gorgeous, and it's going to be made of these sustainable materials, and people are going to love it, and it's going to win the Tour de France. That's our success criteria. But how we get there, we don't know. But we're going to work together. And what happens as you go through the process is kind of an emergence. And eventually we have a bicycle that we don't know what it's going to be, but we know we're successful if it meets certain criteria. That's all we're asking for in schools. Mm-hmm. If we're going to build a sustainable city out of cardboard, for instance, that means nothing. What matters is for the kids to say, what exactly are we going to do? And how at the end will we know that it's a sustainable city? How will we know? Well, it has to have these and these criteria, and we all come up with it. So it's this idea of living systems that we can only disturb it and create the conditions. And our jobs as educators is to create the conditions for the learning to emerge and make sure, and this is the part that's very important, to make sure that we do it together, that we have a certain set of values. And I'm layering this on top, and I'm layering it for a very important reason, because I do think, and this is something else we could talk about, I do think that education has to be values driven. We layer a certain amount of values that allow us to create more conditions for life to thrive on the planet. So we create conditions for learning to emerge in order for more conditions to be created for life to thrive, and so forth and so forth and so forth. Just like a living system grows and restructures, re-networks, reorganizes, depending on those stimuli.
So you're about to become the head of a school, or a part of a school in Bali. So you'll be teaching, you'll be in the classroom with the children, and that's been a big part of your work. So The philosophy that you've outlined there makes tons of sense. Absolutely. I can see that. It's almost like a kind of change model or an outcomes model that you would use with any other kind of process or mission, certainly when you're trying to affect change in a community or in an environment. I can see how that works exactly the same with a person. But how does that translate into day-to-day teaching? Children, yes, we do try and box them and predict them, but they're actually quite complex and messy and will have up days and down days. And sometimes they do need quite a lot of structure and quite a lot of support and quite a lot of rules so that they feel held. And teaching is one of the hardest things to get right. What's your approach to put your model into a space where it's still going to be very hard to get rid of that teacher-pupil dynamic? Talk me through a typical, how do you put a lesson plan together?
You can't. You absolutely can't. And you have to think about this as a long game. You have to think about this as a cultural shift. You have to think about this as everybody needs to have buy-in. You have to rewrite an entire narrative. Now, I'm struck also by this idea that it's better to have no plan and a new vision than a new plan with an old vision. So the emergence of it is in itself, it comes with a package that I don't have a model. I can't say this is exactly how you do it. And that's the whole point of the philosophy of the approach. But it's also this idea that it has to be contextualized based on the school, where the environment, the learners in the room, that moment in the day. Each student's moment in the day has to be looked at. If we think about it, though, I love rules and structures. Rules and structures are awesome. Living systems have structures and they live by a certain set of rules. It's not having rules. It's just making sure that the principles from which we start are every life, be it human, non-human, more than human, has to thrive. That's the number one principle from which we start. And from that point of view, whether or not thriving means being able to read or have certain kind of literacies, whatever that might mean, be able to express themselves, communicate, move other people, touch other people emotionally in the way something is delivered, then we work towards that. And there are certain ways to get to this point. It's just about being flexible and adaptable in the world of learning and doing, and knowing that learning and doing never stop. I'm not talking about lifelong learning. I'm talking about as living systems, we never stop learning. So if we wanted to do a project, for instance, and we wanted to, I don't know, let's say that we decided to create some kind of community where we're going to help the local animals. And that's kind of our learning context that we're having. When you're working with, say, I don't know, I'm making this up, but we're doing wheelchairs for paraplegic dogs, a very worthwhile endeavor in my mind. And there's so much that you can learn with that. You learn about physics, you learn about design, you learn about materials, you learn about marketing, you learn about botany, you learn about biology, you learn about working together. There's so much you do through that project. And along the way, you have this just-in-time learning where you kind of intervene where it matters. Rather than having to front load someone with content, and then maybe they'll apply it, you are learning and applying at the same time, which is how you get deeper learning. It's actually not that far-fetched. What is far-fetched is being able to do it within an institution where you have standards and exams and things that you have different metrics by which you measure the learning. But if we change the way we measure learning, it falls into place. So again, it's a cultural, institutional change that has to happen before any of it can. It's a non-starter if you're preparing kids for high-stakes exams. It's a non-starter or very difficult. So we just have to change the narrative. And I asked the question again, why do we accept the old narrative? There's no reason to, other than fear. Simple as that. And my question is, can we continue this way knowing that we're at the brink of ecological breakdown? It's nothing less than that.
I'm bought in without doubt. And I think, what you're talking about is something I've been talking about, and I've known many people in education, and I come from a family of educators, have been talking about for decades, particularly in the UK system, which it feels like this obsession with high stakes assessment and of kind of linear modeling of what technical and academic ability looks like at the expense of everything that you've talked about there, all of that adaptability, that those communication skills. And we see it in the workplace now. We see it in enterprise. We see it in people's health. We've got a crisis of people who are fearful and don't really know how to be quite a lot of the time because they've been modeled in a particular way. Put that in the context of the climate crisis or other crises, the pandemic and so on. It's pretty dark existential place because we've just not allowed room for any of what you've been talking about. This is a big macro question. How do we change that? You're doing it one class at a time, one school at a time, whereas an open door perhaps. How do we take just a fraction of what you're saying and put that into the minds of legislators, policymakers, head teachers who have the influence to be able to do that cultural shift that you mentioned?
Well, that's the multi-million-dollar question, isn't it? And I'll approach it in two different ways. I'll approach it for the massively macro way, and that's the fact that I don't use the word climate crisis. I don't like the word climate crisis. I guess it's two words, but we might as well make it just one. Mm-hmm. I find climate crisis to be a very anthropocentric, human-centric way of looking at where we are. Because one of the things we don't talk about enough is the loss of biodiversity. We're in the sixth mass extinction. We lost 69% of vertebrates since 1970, but we don't talk about that. We talk about net zero carbon in such a way that, that's what we need to do. But that might mean, in certain circles, that if we can pave the world over but not emit carbon, that might be a decent thing. We talk about carbon, but we don't talk about methane or nitrous oxide. The fact that those are chemicals that come from the food industry. It's easy to flight shame someone, but what about the fact that it's the meat industry that causes so much in terms of water depletion and greenhouse gases? So there's a lot of things here that I think that we can hide behind using the word climate crisis, when climate crisis is a symptom, it's not the cause. And it is a symptom of our selfishness that is not inherent in what we are as humans. It's a system that leads us to be so. It is in every kid's interest who takes a high stakes exam to hope and want that everybody else taking the same exam bombs it. If you're taking your A levels, your IB, you want everybody else to bomb it because on a normal distribution curve, it puts you in a better situation. Mm-hmm. What does that mean in terms of competition? What does that mean in terms of wanting others to do well? It naturally destroys your empathy. And so this is the system that we have, and that's the cause of it. The fact that we don't put our relationships first, and that's with the non-human world as well. And then we talk about climate crisis and let's try to find ways to not have carbon emissions. No, it's not about that. It's about needing to put the relationships first. Now that's very difficult. And so that's something that people have been talking about for thousands and thousands of years. So I don't have an answer here. However, I want to just spotlight this. How do we do it on the day-to-day? I think we could bring it at the most micro of levels, which is the moment-to-moment interactions. And again, this goes back to things that have been said for at least 2,500 years, if not more, but it's the question of every opportunity that we have, every moment-to-moment is our chance to act, or sorry, I should say respond. I don't even, the word act also is a bit of an odd one, but to respond to the world in ways that help the world thrive, that help life thrive. If we can perhaps do that, then we reach, enlightenment. So I'm not saying that's easy either, but that's all we can do. Because as Nora Bateson said, how do we make it so that how can we be a good person? When I talk about the environment, I talk about life on Earth, and I'm talking on a computer where the precious metals inside, the rare metals, were extracted probably by kids. How can I be a good person? The only way we can do so is if we went back to the forest or the jungle and lived naked, or the mountains, or wherever the heck we are in the world. For me, it's the jungle out here in Chiang Mai. That's the only way. And that takes us back to before the agricultural revolution, which, oh, by the way, 3 million years of Homo habilis and beyond and have happened for 3 million years. It's only the last maybe 10,000 years that we've had agriculture that where things have changed. But before that, we were living, in balance with nature. So it's not against our human nature, should I say, to be this way, because for 2,900,000 years, at least, we were living that way. And for some communities, until the last 100 years. So this is what we have to grapple with. These are the questions that we have to grapple with in our consumerist society. And so in the classroom, it means, again, putting relationships first and care and love first. That's all it is. And the learning will happen through that. And if a kid learns that he's or she is loved and held, it's not a bad thing. Probably a lot more important than whatever, quadratic equation, calculus, or, how to write an onomatopoeia in a poem is. That's important too. I'm not saying it's not, but it's not the only thing.
What are you optimistic about?
I am not always optimistic about a lot of things, and at the same time, extremely optimistic about a lot of things. And I guess, it's like this swirl of hope and depression all at the same time. I'm very optimistic about the fact that there's more and more people who are talking about, bringing up words like regeneration. Now, I'm a little bit nervous about regeneration. I've used it for a while, but now that I see that if you type in Coca-Cola and regeneration, there's a web page that comes up, I'm thinking there's going to be a whole bunch of TL washing coming on. So, but the principles of caring and of realizing that we were never disconnected from nature because we are nature, that seems to get more and more traction. Now, it could be the echo chamber in which I am as well. Most of the world's not like that because, let's face it, most of the world is dealing with food issues, food scarcity, health scarcity, violence, poverty, sustainability and regeneration are, let's face it, issues for the global north. Go tell somebody in a country where they can barely feed themselves and there's political instability that we need to think about sustainability and recycling bottles. It makes no sense. So, there's a lot of optimism and realism there. However, at least people are talking about it. Universities, I believe, will have to rethink the way they do admissions. I am really optimistic that they'll require admissions or applicants to have eco-literacies before coming in. That would make a massive difference. So you ask how we get policymakers to change. Force universities and employers to require eco-literacies, just like you require math and reading and writing literacies. That would do a lot. That would do a lot to get people to be more aware of what to do and how to respond. So maybe it's part of that. Maybe the universities have to lead it. Maybe the employers have to lead it, saying we're not hiring anybody who doesn't have a clue about how to create a context where we can live in harmony with the natural world as the natural world. I'm optimistic about that. There's a lot of schools in Europe that are doing that, and I bet you more and more are going to do that because eventually it'll be, why aren't you doing it? What do you mean? You're perpetuating this extractive framework.
Let's pray that tipping point comes sooner rather than later. Absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin Freud, for being a guest on the Possibility Club. Thank you for listening to the Possibility Club, Practical Bravery. If you enjoyed this episode, do like, share, review, tell everybody about it. Look in the show notes for all the details of today's guest, stuff we talked about, stuff that's of interest, new things to read, new things to listen to. And if you are running a business or a charity and you are trying to accelerate or improve the impact that you have in the world, if you want to be famous for what you do and what you change rather than just what you sell, then talk to us. alwayspossible.co.uk. We want to hear from you, we want to talk to you, we want to amplify and elevate your ideas, and who knows, we might be able to help you feel more confident and clear about what's next. alwayspossible.co.uk. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new special guest and a new insight on practical bravery in action.
The Possibility Club is an Always Possible podcast. The interviewer was Richard Freeman for Always Possible, and the producer and editor was me, Chris Thorpe Tracy, for Lo-Fi Arts. Have a good week.
alwayspossible.co.uk.
Lo-Fi